There is a story the United States Army told the world about how the Pacific War was won. In that story, American courage turned the tide. American commanders made the brilliant decisions. American soldiers stopped Japan's advance through the jungle, broke their momentum, and put the empire on the path to total defeat. It is a good story. It has heroes, sacrifice, dramatic reversals of fortune. It has been told in books, documentaries, museums, and presidential speeches. It has been repeated so many times that it has the comfortable feel of established fact. There is only one serious problem with it. For one of the most critical campaigns of the entire Pacific War, the battle that genuinely stopped Japan's southern advance dead in its tracks, the Americans were barely there. The men who bled, starved, broke down, and died in the most savage terrain on earth to stop the Japanese from taking Port Moresby, men who held when every rational calculation said they should have collapsed, were not American. They were Australian. And the moment the fighting stopped, the man who commanded the entire theater from the safety of his Brisbane headquarters made absolutely sure the world would never fully understand that. His name was General Douglas MacArthur. And what he did to Australia's greatest victory in World War II is one of the most breathtaking acts of deliberate historical erasure that military history has ever produced. In this video, we're going to go inside the Owen Stanley Ranges. We're going to follow the Australian soldiers who turned back the Japanese at Kokoda when the entire Pacific hung in the balance. We're going to show you exactly what MacArthur's headquarters did with that victory once the guns fell quiet. We're going to name the documents, the dispatches, the specific orders that buried the truth. And we're going to show you why Australia, the country that actually saved Port Moresby, didn't get the full picture for decades. Stay until the very end, because only in the final minutes will you understand the truly jaw-dropping scale of what was hidden and what it cost the men who deserve the credit most. To understand what happened at Kokoda, you need to understand how desperate the situation was in the Pacific in the middle of 1942. Japan had been at war for a decade. Since 1931, the Japanese military had been methodically consuming Asia, China, Manchuria, Korea, French Indochina. One after another, the dominoes fell. Then, in December 1941, the Japanese unleashed simultaneous attacks across the Pacific with a speed and ferocity that stunned the Western world. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable. The British had spent years and enormous sums building it into what Churchill called an Eastern Gibraltar. 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops held it. The Japanese took it in 7 days. It was the single largest surrender of British-led forces in history, and it shattered the myth of European invincibility in Asia overnight. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the Dutch East Indies. Their navy had just demonstrated at Pearl Harbor that it could strike anywhere. Their army had proven in the jungles of Malaya that Western soldiers were not automatically superior. And now they were looking south. Their next objective was Port Moresby. Port Moresby sits on the southern coast of New Guinea, the enormous jungle-covered island that lies just 150 miles north of Queensland, Australia. If Japan took Port Moresby, they would have a base from which to bomb northern Australia into rubble. They would control the approaches to the Australian continent. They would cut Allied supply lines across the Pacific. The United States would lose a critical staging ground. Australia could potentially be forced out of the war altogether. The Allied command knew this. The Japanese knew this. And everyone knew that the road to Port Moresby ran through the Owen Stanley mountain range, one of the most brutal and unforgiving pieces of terrain on the surface of the planet. The Owen Stanley Range rises from the jungle floor of New Guinea like a wall. The peaks reach over 13,000 feet. The trails are not roads. They are barely paths, carved through primary rainforests so thick that sunlight barely reaches the floor. The mud is ankle-deep in dry season and chest-deep when the rains come. The temperature swings from tropical heat in the lowlands to near freezing at altitude. The jungle is alive with mosquitoes, leeches, tropical diseases, and venomous wildlife. There is no mechanized transport. Everything, food, ammunition, weapons, the wounded, moves on foot or on the backs of Papuan carriers. This was the battlefield. And in July 1942, the Japanese were coming. The Japanese plan to take Port Moresby had two components. The first was a naval invasion, which the Allies stopped at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. The Japanese were turned back from their planned sea route. It was the first time in the Pacific War that Japan had failed to take an objective, and it bought the Allies precious weeks. But Japan did not stop. They simply changed tactics. If they could not come by sea, they would come overland, through the jungle, over the mountains, down the Kokoda Track. On July 21st, 1942, the Japanese 144th Infantry Regiment, followed by elements of the South Seas Force under Major General Tomataro Hori, landed at Gunma on the northern coast of New Guinea. They had approximately 13,500 men, veterans of the conquest of Rabaul, soldiers hardened by years of combat in China and across the Pacific. They were experienced, well-supplied, and absolutely certain that a few weeks of hard marching through the jungle would deliver them Port Moresby. Standing in their way was a single company of the 39th Australian Infantry Battalion. Let that number settle for a moment. One company, approximately 80 to 100 men, against 13,500 veteran Japanese soldiers. These were not the best troops Australia had available. The 39th Battalion was a militia unit, what Australians called chocos, chocolate soldiers, because some believed they would melt under the heat of real combat. Many were teenagers. Some had never fired a weapon in anger. They were poorly equipped, poorly supplied, and positioned in terrain that military doctrine would have called indefensible. They were, in the condescending assessment of every military planner sitting in Brisbane and Washington, completely expendable. What they did next rewrote the definition of military courage. The Kokoda Track runs approximately 60 miles through the Owen Stanley Range, connecting the village of Kokoda on the northern side to Owers Corner on the southern approaches to Port Moresby. 60 miles sounds manageable on paper. In reality, those 60 miles took experienced soldiers 2 weeks each way under combat conditions. The track climbs and descends thousands of feet repeatedly, winding through some of the densest and most hostile jungle in the world. A man carrying a standard combat load, rifle, ammunition, rations, kit, burned an extraordinary number of calories just surviving the march. Supply lines were a nightmare. Airdrops were unreliable. The ground swallowed vehicles. The track barely accommodated a single man walking. In this environment, standard military advantages meant almost nothing. Artillery could not operate effectively. Tanks were completely useless. Air support was limited by cloud cover that sits on the Owen Stanleys almost constantly. The entire campaign would be decided by small units of infantry, man against man, often in visibility measured in feet rather than yards. The 39th Battalion began fighting a series of desperate, delaying actions from Kokoda itself in late July 1942. The situation was militarily absurd. The young Australians were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing soldiers who had been fighting continuously for years. Every tactical calculation pointed to immediate collapse. Instead, they fought. They fought at Kokoda. They fought at Deniki. They fought at Isarava. At each position, they held the Japanese for days at a time before being forced back, then regrouped and held again. They were getting nothing from their commanders in terms of meaningful reinforcement, almost nothing in terms of supply, and absolutely nothing in terms of credit from the Allied headquarters in Brisbane, which was openly dismissing them as militia troops who lacked the fighting quality of the regular AIF, the Australian Imperial Force. The commander of Allied Forces Southwest Pacific Area had a very particular view about who deserved to win battles and who deserved to be mentioned in dispatches. That commander was Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia in March 1942. He had just evacuated the Philippines, leaving behind tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers to fight and ultimately surrender at Bataan. The evacuation was controversial. Many of the men he left behind never forgave him. But in Washington, The decision had been made that MacArthur was too valuable to lose. He arrived in Australia with a reputation that he had almost single-handedly constructed and was fanatically protective of. MacArthur was not merely a general in his own self-conception. He was a figure of destiny, an indispensable man, the supreme warrior commander that an uncertain world required. He had cultivated this image since the First World War, where his genuine battlefield bravery had given him a foundation of real achievement on which to build an ever-expanding mythology. By 1942, the mythology had substantially outgrown the foundation. MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. His headquarters was established in Brisbane, in a building called the AMP Building, which the troops very quickly nicknamed Bataan, with absolutely no affection intended. From this headquarters, MacArthur commanded Australian and American forces across a theater that stretched from New Guinea to the Philippines. There was something important about the composition of those forces that MacArthur was never entirely comfortable acknowledging. In 1942, the overwhelming majority of the fighting forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater were Australian. Australia had been at war since 1939. The Australian Army had been fighting across North Africa, in Greece, in Crete, in Syria, while the United States was still formally at peace. The men who had survived those campaigns, the 6th Division, the 7th Division, the 9th Division, were among the most combat-experienced soldiers in the Allied armies anywhere in the world. MacArthur knew this. He relied on these soldiers completely. He had no choice but to rely on them. The American forces in his theater in 1942 were relatively small in number and relatively untested in combat. But MacArthur had a political problem, and the political problem was enormous. He had been sent to Australia partly to boost morale in a country terrified of invasion, and partly because Washington expected him to win the war in the Pacific. The war in the Pacific, in the American political imagination, was supposed to be an American story. It needed American heroes. It needed American commanders making brilliant decisions. It needed American soldiers winning decisive engagements. A narrative in which the Pacific War was being fought primarily by Australians, with Americans in a supporting role, was simply not the story MacArthur needed to tell. And MacArthur was, above all else, a man who understood the power of the story he told about himself. Back on the track, the war had no interest in anyone's narrative strategy. The 39th Battalion and the reinforcing units that trickled in to support them fought the Japanese in conditions that defy easy description. Private Bruce Kingsbury. Remember that name. August 29, 1942. Isarava. The Japanese were pressing on three sides. The Australian line was on the verge of breaking. A gap had opened in the perimeter. If the Japanese poured through it, the entire position would be overrun and the track to Port Moresby would be wide open. Bruce Kingsbury was 24 years old, a veteran of the campaigns in the Middle East. He had survived the siege of Tobruk. He had fought through Syria. He knew what extreme combat looked like. What he did at Isarava went beyond extreme combat into something that military historians still struggle to describe adequately. Kingsbury picked up a Bren gun, a weapon normally operated by a two-man team, and charged alone directly into the Japanese attack, firing from the hip. He ran through withering Japanese fire, cutting down enemy soldiers, driving the attack back, screaming his presence into the chaos. The men who watched him later described the charge as something out of a different century. A single figure moving through noise and smoke and death with an absolute disregard for his own survival that paralyzed the Japanese advance for the seconds that mattered. The attack was stopped. The gap was closed. Bruce Kingsbury was killed moments later by a Japanese sniper. He was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. It was the first Victoria Cross awarded in the Pacific War. His charge saved the position at Isarava. Had Isarava fallen in that moment, the Australian retreat might have become a rout. The track might have opened to Japanese advance. Port Moresby might have fallen. A 24-year-old man with a Bren gun bought the time that saved the city that potentially saved Australia's northern defenses. This is the kind of story that defines a campaign. This is the name that should be instantly recognizable to anyone who knows the Pacific War. Ask the average American today who Bruce Kingsbury was. Ask them what happened at Isarava. You will almost certainly be met with silence. That silence is not an accident. Through August and into September 1942, the Australian force fell back along the track. It is crucial to understand what that retreat actually looked like, because the word retreat implies a managed, orderly withdrawal. What happened on the Kokoda Track was something much more terrible. The men were starving. Supply lines had broken down catastrophically. Airdrops missed their targets. The jungle floor swallowed supplies that were never found. Men were living on half rations, then quarter rations, then less. Private Burt Ward of the 214th Battalion later recorded that he and his mates went 4 days without food at the height of the retreat, fighting continuously, carrying their wounded, hauling their weapons through mud that sucked at every step. The diseases were relentless. Malaria was universal. Nearly every man on the track contracted it. Dysentery swept through the ranks. Tropical ulcers ate through skin and muscle. Men developed conditions that doctors at the base hospitals had never seen before. Fungal infections that destroyed feet and hands, fevers that spiked to lethal temperatures in hours. The wounded posed a moral crisis that no military manual could resolve. The track was too narrow for stretchers in most places. Carrying a wounded man required 4 other men taken off the fighting line. In some engagements, the Australians had to make devastating decisions about who could be moved and who could not. Some men were left in jungle aid posts to be found, or not found, by the enemy. And yet they fought. The 39th Battalion, the militia unit that the professionals in Brisbane had confidently dismissed as second-rate soldiers, fought continuous delaying actions for over a month. The regular AIF battalions that reinforced them, the February 14th TH, the February 16th TH, the February 27th TH, fought with the same ferocious determination. The Papuan Infantry Battalion, whose local soldiers knew the terrain and fought alongside the Australians with extraordinary effectiveness, fought with the same courage. The Japanese had fully expected to reach Port Moresby within a month of landing. They were still in the jungle 4 months later. And then, in mid-September 1942, something shifted. General Tamatera Horii's South Seas Force had pushed to within 32 miles of Port Moresby. They could see lights from the town on clear nights. For weeks they had been winning every significant engagement, grinding the Australians back kilometer by bloody kilometer. And then they stopped. There were multiple reasons. Japanese logistics had broken down as catastrophically as Australian logistics. The jungle consumed supplies with equal indiscriminate cruelty. Horii's men were starving too. In some units, soldiers were slaughtering pack horses for food. The naval battles around Guadalcanal had forced Japan to redirect resources, and Horii's supply chain, always fragile, became a trickle and then almost nothing. But the primary reason the Japanese stopped was simpler and more brutal than logistics. The Australians would not break. The Japanese South Seas Force was a battle-hardened, veteran force. It had conquered Rabaul. Its soldiers had been fighting for years. They had assumed that the young Australians in front of them would eventually reach a breaking point, a moment when the accumulation of casualties, starvation, disease, and relentless pressure would cause the line to simply dissolve. That moment never came. General Horii sent increasingly desperate signals to his headquarters acknowledging that his offensive had stalled. Not because of American intervention. There were no American ground forces anywhere near the Kokoda Track at this point. Not because of brilliant Allied strategic maneuver. Because Australian infantry, in conditions of extreme deprivation, simply refused to be beaten. In mid-September 1942, the Japanese began to pull back. The Australians, reinforced and reorganized under Lieutenant General Sir Edmund Herring, and with the arrival of the 25th Brigade, began to advance. The counterattack up the track was, if anything, worse than the retreat. The Japanese had dug in. Every position on the track north of the gap had been turned into a fortress. Bunkers cut from logs and earth absorbed mortar rounds and machine gun fire. The Japanese fought with the same ferocity in defense that they had shown in attack. Every 100 meters of track cost blood. But the Australians advanced. Through October and November 1942, they clawed their way back up the Owen Stanley Range. Kokoda was retaken on November 2nd. The Australian flag was raised over the village by the survivors of the 25th Brigade, men who could barely stand, men who had lost a third of their numbers coming up the track, men who wept openly without embarrassment because they had survived what they had survived. The battles at Oivigarari in early November destroyed what remained of the Japanese force on the track. General Horii himself drowned attempting to cross the Kamusi River in retreat. His South Seas force, which had landed at Gunma with 13,500 men, had been shattered. The Japanese would never again threaten Port Moresby. The Kokoda campaign was over. Australia had won. And now the man in the AMP building in Brisbane went to work on the story. Douglas MacArthur's public relations operation was unlike anything the Allied military had ever seen. Other generals had press officers. MacArthur had a propaganda machine. At the center of it was Brigadier General Courtney Whitney and the team of staff officers and journalists MacArthur kept close. These men understood their primary function. It was not to inform the public about the war. It was to ensure that every significant development in the Southwest Pacific Theater was presented in a way that reflected maximum credit on the Supreme Commander. MacArthur's communiques, the official dispatches from his headquarters to the press, were famous or infamous, depending on your position. His staff officers rewrote them with his personal approval before release. They were florid, triumphant, and almost universally written in the third person. MacArthur's name appeared in them constantly. The word, "I almost never did." Instead, it was always General MacArthur's forces have achieved. Or, under General MacArthur's masterful direction. The men actually doing the fighting had a name for these dispatches. They called them communiques. But privately, behind closed hands in jungle foxholes and field hospitals, they had another name for them. They called them fairy tales. Australian officers were particularly sharp in their private assessments. General Thomas Blamey, the commander of Allied land forces, had a relationship with MacArthur that was professional and deeply antagonistic beneath the surface. Blamey was a complex and often difficult figure himself, but he was no fool. He watched MacArthur's headquarters produce communique after communique that shaped public understanding of the campaign and understood exactly what was being done and why. What makes the Kokoda case particularly egregious, what elevates it from the ordinary vanity of a self-promoting commander to something much darker, is the specific and systematic nature of how Australian contributions were minimized. This is not a matter of interpretation. The documents exist. Historians have read them. The pattern is undeniable. The first tool was the communique. During the Kokoda campaign, MacArthur's headquarters issued dozens of official press dispatches. These were the primary source of information for newspapers in the United States and around the world. When people in New York, London, or Sydney opened their morning papers to read about the Pacific War, what they read was almost entirely derived from MacArthur's communiques. Read those communiques carefully, and a pattern emerges with disturbing clarity. Units are mentioned by nationality when it is favorable to do so. American forces have repelled Japanese attacks. Allied troops under General MacArthur's command are advancing. When the fighting is going badly, or when the credit clearly belongs to Australians, the language shifts. The Australians become Allied forces. They become troops. They become part of a generic mass that fights under MacArthur's direction without specific national identity. Historian David Horner, one of the most authoritative scholars on Australia's role in the Second World War, documented this pattern in exhaustive detail. The communiques rarely mentioned Australian units by name during the critical phases of the Kokoda campaign. When they did, it was often to criticize. And that brings us to the second tool, perhaps the most damaging one. MacArthur blamed the Australians for the retreat. In late September 1942, as the Australian force was still on the track, still fighting, still bleeding its way forward after the Japanese offensive had stalled, MacArthur sent a series of messages to General Blamey that were extraordinary in their contempt. He accused the Australian militia troops of having retreated in the face of the enemy. He implied that the men on the track lacked the fighting spirit necessary to win. He demanded answers. MacArthur, at this point, had not set foot in New Guinea. He had observed the Kokoda campaign entirely from Brisbane. His knowledge of the conditions on the track came from reports, and some of those reports were deeply misleading about the reality of what the men were experiencing. But MacArthur did not let ignorance slow him down. On September 23, 1942, he communicated directly to WW2. The Australians have proven themselves unable to match the Japanese in jungle fighting. In another message, he demanded that WW2 go personally to New Guinea to take personal command and lead your troops in a battle. He questioned the fighting quality of the militia units in terms that were, to put it plainly, not much different from the language the British had used to dismiss Australian soldiers in Cairo 2 years earlier. WW2 went to New Guinea, standing in front of exhausted, skeletal men who had been fighting without adequate food, without adequate medicine, without adequate support from the headquarters that was now criticizing them. WW2 delivered a speech to the 21st Brigade that became one of the most controversial moments of the campaign. He told them they had been defeated because they ran like rabbits. The men stood in stunned silence. These were soldiers who had retreated because they were ordered to retreat, fighting delaying actions against overwhelming numbers with empty stomachs and jamming weapons. Some of them had been on the track for months. Some had malaria. Some had wounds that had been treated with whatever materials the jungle provided. They had not run like rabbits. They had done the most difficult thing soldiers are ever asked to do: hold long enough to be worth something and retreat without breaking. Several officers who witnessed WW2's speech later described the reaction in terms that are unprintable in polite company. And MacArthur's headquarters filed the speech away as evidence in support of the narrative they were constructing, that the Australians had failed, that strong leadership had corrected the problem, and that the subsequent victory on the track was a testament to the genius of Allied command and of the soldiers who arrived later, including, eventually, American troops. American ground forces did enter the New Guinea campaign. In October and November 1942, the 32nd U.S. Infantry Division was deployed to the Bunaguna area on the northern coast, tasked with capturing the Japanese beachhead, while Australian forces drove the enemy back down the track. This is where the historical distortion becomes most acute and most damaging. The 32nd Division was a National Guard formation from Michigan and Wisconsin. Its men were patriotic and brave. They were also, in late 1942, almost completely unprepared for what they encountered. They had minimal jungle training. They had no experience fighting in conditions anything like the Owen Stanley Range. They had officers who were competent in peacetime, but had never led men in combat. The Bunaguna campaign, which ran from November 1942 through January 1943, was catastrophically costly. The 32nd Division suffered horrendous casualties. Disease and combat wounds combined to destroy units at terrifying rates. The American soldiers fought in conditions nearly as brutal as those the Australians had endured on the track, and they suffered accordingly. MacArthur watched the 32 ND Division's performance with increasing fury and distress. These were his American soldiers. They were supposed to validate his narrative of American strength and decisiveness. Instead, they were being stopped cold by Japanese bunkers and jungle disease in ways that were embarrassingly similar to what the militia Australians had experienced months earlier. At one point, MacArthur threatened to have the 32 ND Division's commander relieved. He sent his Chief of Staff, General Richard Sutherland, to the front, though significantly, Sutherland himself did not go all the way to the actual front lines. It was the Australian 7th Division, under Major General George Vassie, fighting simultaneously at Bunaguna alongside the Americans, that ultimately broke the Japanese resistance. Australian troops, particularly the 2/7th and 2 9th Battalions, took the most strongly fortified Japanese positions in the area. The combination of Australian experience, tactics developed on the Kokoda Track, and the sheer grinding determination that had already defined the campaign was what ultimately defeated the Japanese beachhead. But look at how MacArthur's communiques described the victory. American and Allied forces under General MacArthur have defeated the Japanese at Bunagana. The American contribution was prominently featured. The Australian contribution was subsumed into the generic Allied. The brilliant tactical adaptation the Australians had demonstrated, the lessons learned in blood on the Kokoda Track now being applied at Bunagana, received no specific acknowledgement. The American press reported a great American victory in the Pacific. MacArthur's stock rose. His image as a decisive, visionary commander was reinforced, and the men of the 25th Brigade who had retaken Kokoda, the veterans of the 39th Battalion who had bought the time that made everything else possible, the sick and skeletal soldiers who had carried the entire weight of the campaign for months before any American arrived, they came home to a very different reception. MacArthur controlled the official record of the Southwest Pacific Theater with an iron grip. War correspondents in his theater operated under MacArthur's censorship. Anything he did not want reported was not reported. Journalists who wrote critically of his command found their dispatches blocked. Those who played along with the narrative were given access and cooperation. Australian war correspondents were in a particularly difficult position. They were operating in a theater commanded by an American general who had every incentive to minimize Australian contributions. Their dispatches went through censorship that was, at its highest level, controlled by MacArthur's staff, writing the full truth about what Australians had done and what American forces had initially failed to do, risked both censorship and the kind of political complications that wartime governments desperately wanted to avoid. Some correspondents pushed through anyway. Chester Wilmot, the brilliant Australian journalist whose later book, The Struggle for Europe, became a classic of war reporting, tried to tell the Kokoda story accurately and found himself in direct conflict with MacArthur's headquarters. Wilmot was eventually banned from the Southwest Pacific Theater. The official reason given was technical. The real reason was obvious to anyone paying attention. In the official histories compiled during and after the war, the pattern continued. The American official history of the war in the Pacific devoted considerable space to the role of U.S. forces in New Guinea. It was written with access to American records and the full cooperation of MacArthur's headquarters. The Australian contribution was acknowledged, but consistently framed as secondary, as background to the main American effort. Douglas MacArthur, the Australian official historian who wrote the volume covering Kokoda, Southwest Pacific Area, first year, published in 1959, worked from Australian records and interviews with surviving veterans. His account told a very different story. It documented the Australian sacrifices clearly and with precision. It acknowledged the American role honestly, but placed it in proper proportion. But the Australian official history was read in Australia. The American official history was read in America, and more broadly, in the English-speaking world. The dominant historical narrative in the decades after the war was shaped primarily by American sources and MacArthur's self-serving account in his own memoirs. MacArthur's memoir, Reminiscences, published in 1964, is a remarkable document. It is beautifully written, consistently self-aggrandizing, and strategically vague in ways that a careful reader can decode fairly easily. The Kokoda campaign appears in it as a crisis resolved by MacArthur's decisive leadership. The Australian soldiers who actually fought it appear as part of the background. Bruce Kingsbury does not appear. The 39th Battalion does not appear by name. The conditions on the track, the starvation, the disease, the extraordinary human cost, are summarized in a few sentences. MacArthur describes the Kokoda campaign as one in which a strategic genius identified the critical importance of Papua. His decisions ensured the necessary forces were deployed, and his leadership inspired the Allied troops to victory. He was in Brisbane for nearly the entire campaign. Let us be precise about the numbers, because the numbers are the most eloquent argument against the narrative MacArthur constructed. Australian casualties in the Kokoda Track campaign from July to November 1942 totaled approximately 2,165 killed in action, with an additional 3,533 wounded. These figures do not include the thousands evacuated due to disease, malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, and related tropical illnesses that accounted for between 5 and 10 sick evacuations for every battle casualty. The 39th Battalion, the militia unit dismissed as Chacos, unfit for serious combat, suffered casualties of approximately 50%. Half the battalion, teenagers and young men who had never been in combat before, handed inadequate equipment and told to hold a track against a veteran army outnumbering them by orders of magnitude. They held the 214th Battalion at Isarava, the battle where Bruce Kingsbury died, lost so many men in a single day of fighting that the unit barely existed as a coherent fighting force by nightfall. The survivors fought on. The Papua Infantry Battalion, whose local soldiers carried supplies, evacuated wounded, and fought alongside the Australians with extraordinary bravery and intimate knowledge of the terrain, received almost no recognition in any formal account of the campaign. Their contribution, essential, irreplaceable, was nearly invisible in the official narrative. The Papuan carriers, the fuzzy wuzzy angels, as the Australians called them with genuine affection and respect, carried wounded soldiers over the Owen Stanleys on improvised stretchers. They worked guided by loyalty to the Australians they serve alongside and a fierce opposition to Japanese occupation. Without them, the casualty toll would have been incomprehensibly higher. In MacArthur's communiques, they do not appear at all. Australian deaths were presented to the Allied public as statistics in a broader campaign. Individual stories of courage like Bruce Kingsbury's Victoria Cross were reported in Australia and virtually ignored everywhere else. The strategic importance of what the Australians had done, holding Port Moresby's last land approaches when the stakes were at their absolute highest, was framed in American accounts as one component of a broader Allied effort rather than as the singular achievement it was. This raises an uncomfortable question. If Australian historians knew, if Australian veterans knew, if Australian war correspondents like Chester Wilmot suspected and reported what they could, why did the full picture take so long to emerge? The answer involves politics, wartime loyalty, and the peculiar relationship between Australia and its powerful ally. In 1942 and 1943, Australia was terrified of invasion. The country that had seemed impossibly distant from the war, in 1939, was suddenly the front line. Japanese submarines had shelled Sydney Harbor. The fall of Singapore had shattered assumptions about British protection. The Australian government looked at the Pacific War and understood with crystalline clarity that without the United States, Australia might genuinely lose. In that context, maintaining the American alliance was an existential necessity. Publicly disputing MacArthur's narrative, accusing the Supreme Commander of deliberately minimizing Australian contributions, of blaming Australian soldiers for failures they had not committed, of systematically constructing a false account of who had done what, was simply not politically possible. Prime Minister John Curtin needed MacArthur. Australia needed MacArthur. Whatever private frustrations existed, and they existed in abundance, as the private correspondence of Australian politicians and generals makes abundantly clear, they were kept private. MacArthur was aware of this dynamic. He exploited it with the calculated precision of a politician who had spent decades navigating institutional power. He knew the Australians could not publicly call him out. He knew that American political support was indispensable to Australian survival. He used that leverage to protect his narrative with complete confidence that the full accounting would never come. After the war, the dynamic shifted but did not disappear. Australia was now a junior partner in a Western alliance led by the United States. The Cold War made maintaining American goodwill even more important. Reopening the question of what had actually happened at Kokoda, formally, diplomatically, in terms that would require the United States to revise its official historical accounts, was a fight that successive Australian governments calculated was not worth having. The veterans themselves were in an impossible position. They knew what they had done. Many of them lived with the knowledge for decades that the story told about their war was not the story they had experienced. Some wrote memoirs. Some gave interviews. Some testified to official historians. Slowly, carefully, the Australian account accumulated. But it accumulated in Australia. It accumulated in academic journals and official histories that reached specialists, but not general audiences. It accumulated in a national memory that was vivid and accurate inside Australia, and almost completely invisible to the rest of the world. The classified documents and internal communications that showed most clearly what MacArthur's headquarters had done. The specific decisions to omit, minimize, or reframe Australian contributions were locked in archives on both sides of the Pacific, and not all of them accessible to researchers until decades after the war. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, as archives opened and a generation of historians with full access to the documentary record began to publish, that the complete picture began to emerge in forms that reached beyond academic specialists to general audiences. Even then, the process was slow. Even then, resistance remained. To understand the full scope of the injustice, consider the contrast between how history treated Douglas MacArthur and how it treated the men who actually won the Kokoda campaign. MacArthur received the Medal of Honor in March 1942, before Kokoda, while he was still in the Philippines. There was controversy about that award, even at the time, with some arguing that the citation was politically motivated rather than purely military. He ultimately ended the war as one of the most decorated and celebrated military figures in American history. He accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri. He commanded the occupation of Japan with imperial authority. He ran for president. He was the subject of biographies, films, tributes, and monuments. He died in 1964 at age 84, after delivering one of the most celebrated farewell speeches in American military history at West Point. Duty, honor, country. Consider Lieutenant General Edmund Herring, the Australian commander who oversaw the crucial phase of the Kokoda counteroffensive. He was a skilled and effective commander who managed extraordinarily complex operations under extreme conditions. He served with distinction throughout the Pacific War. After the war, he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria. He is remembered fondly in Australia, and almost completely unknown outside it. Consider Major General Arthur Tubby Allen, commander of the 7th Division during the critical Kokoda fighting. Allen was a fighting general in the truest sense, a man who lived close to his troops and understood the conditions on the ground with an intimacy that the staff in Brisbane never approached. He was actually relieved of command by MacArthur in late October 1942, a decision that remains deeply controversial and that many historians attribute at least partly to MacArthur's frustration that the campaign was not proceeding at the pace he demanded, regardless of the physical realities of the track. Allen was replaced, the campaign was won, and the credit accrued upward through the command chain to MacArthur. Allen returned to Australia and lived quietly until his death in 1959. No Medal of Honor, no ticker-tape parade. The general who commanded the division that turned the tide at Kokoda died without the kind of global recognition that the scale of what he had achieved arguably warranted. And consider the ordinary soldiers. Private Bruce Kingsbury, V.C., killed at Isarava. The men of the 39th Battalion who held the track when nothing said they should be able to. The Papuan carriers who carried the wounded over the mountains and received almost nothing in return. Most of them came home to a country that was proud of them, but that understood, in the way that small nations always understand with slightly sick hearts, that the story the world was telling about the war they had fought was not quite right, and that making it right was going to be harder than it should have been. Here is the deepest irony of what Douglas MacArthur did. MacArthur's obsessive management of his own reputation was driven by a fear, perhaps the central fear of his career, that his actual record would not withstand scrutiny. That beneath the magnificent self-presentation was a general who, when the chips were truly down, had not been where the chips were falling. At Bataan, he had commanded from a fortified island while his troops fought and died on the peninsula. At Kokoda, he had commanded from a building in Brisbane while Australians fought and died on a track he never walked. At Bunaguna, his presence in New Guinea amounted to brief visits that his own staff photographed extensively for press release purposes. MacArthur did not lack physical courage. His record in the First World War was genuine and impressive. But the Second World War revealed something different. The man who had been brave in the trenches of France was, in the Pacific, a headquarters general. He moved pieces on maps. He issued orders. He wrote magnificent dispatches. He left the dying to others. And the people he left the dying to were, overwhelmingly, Australians. His effort to claim their sacrifice as the product of his genius was not simply vanity. It was also, at some level, an attempt to prevent the obvious question from being asked. If you were directing all of this from Brisbane, exactly what was your indispensable contribution? The Australians on the Kokoda Track provided the answer he needed. Their extraordinary performance gave him a victory to claim. Their suffering gave him a narrative of hardship overcome. Their sacrifice gave him the laurels he paraded before the American public and the Washington establishment. He could not acknowledge their contribution fully without illuminating the gap between his claimed role and his actual one. So he buried it. And for decades, in the broad sweep of global historical consciousness, it stayed buried. The full reckoning came slowly and incompletely, but it came. Australian historian Peter Brune spent years in archives on multiple continents, compiling a meticulous account of the Kokoda campaign and the MacArthur headquarters treatment of it. His books, published in the 1990s and 2000s, documented the specific mechanisms of the cover-up with a precision that made it impossible to dismiss. David Horner's comprehensive histories of the Australian military in the Second World War provided the institutional context. His work demonstrated, through exhaustive document analysis, that the distortions in the official record were not accidental. They were the result of deliberate decisions made in MacArthur's headquarters and allowed to stand by political calculations on both sides of the Pacific. Carl James at the Australian War Memorial produced research that identified specific communiques, specific dispatches, and specific internal documents showing the gap between what MacArthur's headquarters knew and what it chose to report publicly. The Australian War Memorial itself became a site of memory and resistance. Its galleries devoted to the Kokoda campaign present the Australian account with unflinching detail. The exhibits on the Kokoda Track, the muddy boots, the haversacks, the letters home, the photographs of skeletal men standing in front of jungle that should not be survivable, tell a story that is simultaneously intimate and enormous. In recent decades, the Kokoda Track has become one of the most significant pilgrimage sites in the Australian national memory. Thousands of Australians, young and old, walk the track each year. They walk it to understand what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers experienced. They walk it because the story of the track is a story about what Australia was when the worst happened, about what Australians were made of when the worst happened. The walk takes between 8 and 12 days for reasonably fit, well-equipped hikers with modern gear, clear trails, and no one shooting at them. The men of 1942 did it carrying everything they owned, eating almost nothing, with a Japanese army trying to kill them. Why does this matter now? Why should anyone care, 80 years later, about the narrative management strategies of a general who has been dead for 60 years? It matters for several reasons, and none of them are sentimental. The first is the most straightforward. Historical truth has value in itself. The men who fought on the Kokoda Track, who died there, who came back permanently marked by what they experienced, they are owed an accurate account of what they did. Not out of nostalgia, but out of basic moral seriousness about what it means when human beings sacrifice everything in the service of a shared purpose. Getting the record right is the minimum that honesty demands. The second reason is strategic and ongoing. Australia's understanding of its own military history, of its capacities and its place in the world, is shaped by the stories it tells about moments like Kokoda. A story that has been systematically distorted produces a distorted self-understanding. The work of Australian historians in recovering the accurate record of Kokoda is not antiquarian. It is an act of national self-knowledge that has direct relevance to how Australia thinks about defense, about alliances, about the relationship between military contribution and political credit. The third reason is universal and disturbing. What MacArthur did at Kokoda was not unprecedented. Throughout military history, commanders have managed the stories of battles to serve their own interests and the interests of their nation's self-conceptions. The machinery MacArthur used, censorship, controlled communiques, narrative framing, differential access for friendly and hostile press, was not invented by him. It existed before him, and it exists after him. Understanding how it worked at Kokoda is understanding how it always works. It works because the people who control the story control the record, and the record shapes memory, and memory shapes everything. The Australians who survived the Kokoda campaign came home knowing the truth. They had lived it. They could not be lied to about what they had experienced, but they could watch the story told about them be slowly, systematically adjusted. A word changed here, a unit name omitted there, an emphasis shifted, a credit reassigned, until the story the world believed bore a diminishing relationship to the story they knew. Some of them never stopped being angry about it. Some of them, in interviews conducted years and decades later, described that anger with a precision and clarity that makes clear it had never softened with age. They were not angry because they needed medals or parades. They were angry because the men who died on the track deserved to be remembered for what they had actually done, and the machinery of the story had denied them that. On August 14, 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Isarava, a memorial was unveiled at the site where Bruce Kingsbury made his fatal charge. The memorial consists of 4 pillars, each representing one of the values that the Kokoda veterans identified as defining their experience: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. It stand in the jungle where the line held, where young Australians who should never have been able to hold, held, where history pivoted on the decisions of terrified, starving, sick young men who refused, for reasons that no military manual has ever fully explained and no political narrative has ever properly credited, to break. The Japanese could not break them. Disease could not break them. Starvation could not break them. MacArthur's contemptuous assessment of their fighting quality could not break them. The only thing that came close to breaking them was coming home to discover that the story of what they had done had been quietly given to someone else. The memorial at Isarava is visited today by those thousands of Australians who walk the track each year. Many of them stop there for a long time. Some leave things, flowers, photographs, slouch hats. The jungle has grown back around the pillars. The place looks peaceful now. You have to work to imagine what it looked like in August 1942, when the ground was torn open and the air was full of smoke and a 24-year-old man was running with a Bren gun into a wall of Japanese fire. But if you work at it, you can imagine. And if you imagine hard enough, the question becomes inescapable. Why don't more people know his name? The answer is Douglas MacArthur. The answer is the AMP building in Brisbane. The answer is the communiques written in the third person. The answer is Chester Wilmot being banned from the theater. The answer is the official histories that said Allied forces when they meant Australians. The answer is the political calculation that the alliance mattered more than the record. The answer is that power decides what the story is, and MacArthur had the power. But power is not permanent, and neither are the stories it tells. There is a question I want to leave you with. If the Australians at Kokoda had been American, how many films would have been made about them? How many monuments would line the mall in Washington? How many children in schools around the English-speaking world would know the name Bruce Kingsbury the way they know Audie Murphy or Alvin York? We cannot answer that question with certainty, but we can answer a related one. The men of the 39th Battalion, the veterans of Isarava, the Papuan carriers, the soldiers who fell back along the track while buying time they knew might cost them everything. They did not need the approval of the man in the AMP building. They did not need his communiques to validate what they had done. They did not need him to credit them with saving Port Moresby, because they knew they had saved it. And in that knowledge, there was something the machinery of erasure could never touch. Something that lives now in the archives where the real record was always preserved, in the families who kept the letters and the photographs, in the jungle itself where the track still runs through the Owen Stanley Range, and in the stubborn, inconvenient fact of what actually happened. The truth about Kokoda is not a comfortable truth for the mythology of the Pacific War. It does not fit neatly into the story that was told for 50 years. It requires revising assumptions and reassigning credit and acknowledging that the most important battle in the defense of Australia was fought and won before most Americans in the theater had fired a single shot. But it is the truth. And truth, as the men on the Kokoda Track demonstrated in the most extreme possible terms, does not surrender. Not even when the odds are 13,500 to 80. Not even when the headquarters says you are finished. Not even when the general takes the credit. The track holds the memory. Australia holds the memory. And now so do you.